Welcome to Coruzant Technologies, home of the Digital Executive Podcast. Welcome to the Digital Executive. Today's guest is Alistair Fulton. Alistair Fulton is the Vice President and General Manager of Semtech's Wireless and Sensing Products Group. He joined Semtech in 2018 with over 25 years of experience in the IoT, connected device, machine-to-machine, embedded, and analytics spaces. Before joining Semtech, Alistair led the development of Hitachi's Lumada Industrial IoT platform, the leading visionary industrial IoT platform in Gartner's 2018 Magic Quadrant. Prior to Hitachi, he led Microsoft's IoT initiative, including the development and incubation of Microsoft's version 1 IoT platform, the precursor to the version 3 Azure IoT platform. Well, good afternoon, Alistair. Welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you, Brian.
Awesome. Glad to have you on, Alistair. It's been a while that I've been doing these podcasts, and what's exciting is to really hear your story, but turn around and share it with the globe. So I'm going to jump right into the questions. Alistair, you've got quite the career in emerging technology, specifically working with IoT, the Internet of Things, for many years, including Microsoft and Semtech. Could you share with our audience the secret to your career growth and what inspires you?
That's a good question. I've always felt that the people who tell you that their career was meticulously planned out and they knew what they were going to do, from the cradle on upwards, well, they're either incredibly fortunate and incredibly rare or a touch delusional. I mean, I look back on my career to date, I see a series of quite happy coincidences, guided by one singular thing. And that was really a desire early on to work on interesting things, to do things that I personally found fascinating, and things that, going back to, I've always worked in product development or strategy development or in one way or form. And I started out, like many people in the IoT space, in a kind of mobile world with some combinations of internet technologies. Back in my very early career, I worked on things like the first home shopping service that, and this dates me, was based on CD-ROMs because the internet wasn't quite good enough to be able to distribute a catalog of products. But it was, I think, the first online shopping experience that was the precursor of obviously what we have today. And at the time, I kind of thought, I was struck by the technology, and I thought, this emerging space is something that's really going to change the way in which we live, and it's really going to change the way in which I live. And it's very unclear how it's going to evolve, other than that it's going to change a lot. And the territory is very much uncharted. You don't know who's going to win. You don't know what the product's going to be. And I found that intellectually intriguing. I found my way almost inevitably with the convergence of the emergent internet and cellular, which came with 2.5G, 2G. You could argue GPRS a little. As cellular technologies became more advanced, and it became possible to build applications that did really quite interesting things using cellular as a platform. I can actually more or less remember the time. I kind of sat down and thought to myself, again, this is a really interesting technology. This is going to change a whole bunch of stuff. It's going to change the way in which we all live. No idea how, but cell phones are clearly going to play a big part in this digitization. I can't even remember what we called it at the time. I don't think we had digitization. We certainly didn't have IoT. And so I spent a few years working with a company in the UK called O2. It was actually, I joined the company when it span out of British Telecom, which was at the time, this kind of anachronistic old infrastructure-based giant in the UK, very stodgy, very slow, and a company that really didn't understand the potential of mobile to transform things, to the extent to which they actually span out their mobile business. Right at the beginning of the mobile internet in the 2000s, they decided that then was the time to jettison the cellular business because it looked a bit pricey. It looked as though it was going to cost quite a lot of money in the upcoming 3G licenses and so on. But I spent several years there, initially helping drive the demerger from British Telecom, and then really working as part of the management team to kind of re-engineer the company, to recreate the brand and really create a business that was much more forward-looking and focused more on customer experiences and content and the incremental value over and above, being able to talk to each other or text each other that cell phones created in that era. And I stayed in that space probably 4 or 5 years, purely in cellular. And then within cellular, it started becoming really obvious that two things happened. I think the technology platform started to stabilize and the capabilities became clear, which was positive. The negative was that cellular operators, O2 included, and this was partly driven by the cost of the 3G license auctions. We figured out at the time, geez, we'd better figure out some extra ways of making money because we just got hit with several $1 billion worth of licenses. And clearly where that money's going to come from is from applications and content. And I think O2, in common with all of the other operators at the time, sat on that opportunity and tried to protect it. And as a consequence, Apple and other companies, they moved faster and they came over the top and they really stole away the prize from under the cellular operators' very noses, and it was gone. And that kind of struck me quite hard. And it also struck me that there was a real diversification of what it meant to be an application developer, what it meant to use data to drive decisions, and that extended very clearly way beyond human to human interactions. And actually, that there was far more potential to make meaningful change in the machine space. And again, in that period, microelectronics really started to kick in. The notion of low power microcontrollers, the power that you could put into a device that didn't have a user interface, really accelerated during that period. And so again, the same kind of test for me. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. This is going to change people's lives, including mine. It's uncharted and unknown. Yeah, that looks like a very interesting thing and a very exciting thing to go and spend some time in. And that was kind of it. That kind of got me into the IoT. In the early days, I spent a number of years when I emigrated to the US in about 2005, having a life-changing event in the form of the loss of my first wife to asthma. And I packed up and actually went and lived in the Caribbean for a couple of years and taught people to dive, and then kind of re-emerged in the US and joined a consulting business, building IoT and mostly cellular IoT in that time, cellular IoT applications and the business cases around those applications, which was very interesting exposure. I'd rather be doing, if you like, than necessarily advising, though that said, a lot of my work at my job at the moment is obviously advising others. So I left the consulting business and I joined Microsoft. And I joined originally to help run an off-campus incubation unit, secret, no Microsoft branding, working for one of the guys who founded the Xbox business, a guy called Jay Allard. He was one of the wunderkind in Microsoft. He was groomed by Bill Gates over many years. Truly brilliant guy. He's since left Microsoft and is doing a variety of things at the moment. And one of the things I wanted to do in that incubation unit, and obviously this was Microsoft trying to figure out how to move very rapidly, how to build new technologies and to innovate in an agile way, which I've got to be honest, in 2009 wasn't where Microsoft was. That was Microsoft in the latter days of Steve Ballmer, and a Microsoft that had been left wounded by various rulings based on Microsoft's anti-competitive behavior. It was really limping along in terms of innovation as a company. So it was a unit called Alchemy Ventures, and that was really part of Microsoft's realization of that issue. And so one of the things I figured that I wanted to do when I joined Microsoft was really demonstrate by doing, rather than espousing theory about how to run rapid product development exercises, which essentially is what I'd been doing for the last few years with Deloitte Consulting. I thought, best to demonstrate rather than talk. And so I founded a project which turned into, over the years, Azure IoT. And it started with a very simple concept, and that was this. The power of cloud-based computing was really only starting to become apparent at that point. And it seems like hardly any time ago. And if you look at the progress that's happened in the meantime, the pace of change is blistering. Back in 2009, the cloud was kind of again, one of those, like, well, that's quite interesting. It's going to change things. Not really sure how, not really sure who's going to be the winner. But the thing that was really apparent to me coming from the cellular space and working in connected devices was the thing that's going to drive all of these powerful analytics is going to be data. And that data is going to be derived from things. I don't even think that IoT was really a common phrase back in 2009. But the problem with those things is they don't have user interfaces. They're pretty dumb, most of them. It's a one-to-many problem. There's going to be a lot of them, and managing these devices is going to be critical. So that was really the thought process that stood behind. The project name was B3 at the time. And I spent a couple of years kind of building that out. The way that the incubation project worked was you went and pitched to senior management and secured funding, and then went off and, I built a team of engineers and program managers and built the first kind of prototypes of the platform. And I transitioned it into the Windows Embedded business unit, and over time helped drive Windows Embedded to be not Windows Embedded, but to be Windows IoT. I spent a couple of years having got the train rolling, if you like. It was clear that acquisition was going to play a critical part in really scaling Microsoft's ability, as much as anything else, to bring in new blood, to bring in new, innovation and energy into still what was quite a staid and slow-moving environment, even as Satya Nadella, who I was fortunate enough to work quite closely to for a couple of years, came to the front. So I worked in acquisitions for a couple of years, building business cases to acquire and acquiring analytics capabilities and cloud management capabilities and so forth. And then I spent my last couple of years there building developer tools, because that was somewhat opportunistically. I was like, okay, we need to make this easy for developers to use. And so what's missing? I'm a terrible software developer, and back in the day I learned how to program in C and C++, and those languages are pretty cumbersome, and it was very apparent that we needed to make it a hell of a lot easier for developers to be able to build IoT solutions. And so I spent a couple of years doing that, and then subsequently an opportunity came up to join Hitachi at the very beginnings of their industrial IoT platform, Lumada, which I spent 3 years building out from zero to what's really a quite credible industrial IoT of today. So far so that both Azure IoT and Lumada were 2 of the 3 recognized leaders in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for industrial IoT, which was obviously very flattering for all of the folks who were, and there were many who were involved in both platforms. And that kind of leads me up to present day. And the realization, I guess, again, as I sat within Hitachi and looked around, like, wow, the Lumada platform was great. Azure IoT by that point was really a very, very rich offering. PTC, which is the other leader recognized by Gartner, also a really mature platform. And I had one of the team do an audit to count up how many Azure IoT platforms were out there, both the real ones and the purported ones, the ones that were actually executable and the ones that were PowerPoint. And as I used to joke at the time, PowerPoint's not an executable. You can't actually count as a platform. But nevertheless, the problem that each of those platforms had was a singular one, and that was still, it's very difficult to connect lots and lots and lots and lots of sensors to a platform to generate data. And to me, the promise of the IoT or M2M or telematics, or however you want to describe it, was always the ability to use data to make better decisions and the ability to use those decisions to improve outcomes. And generally, those outcomes are producing more from less. During that period of time, it became apparent to me, as it did to many others, that the path that we're on as a species is one that trails towards a bad place based on our current consumption of resources, and that most of that consumption, or at least the wastage, was driven not by a desire, it was just driven by bad decision making. The way to address that really was to enable the collection of a better data set. The tools to analyze that data set already existed in the form of cloud platforms, but having built many POCs with industrial customers whilst I was at Hitachi, going through and figuring out how to connect sensors in a steel mill, it doesn't get much worse in terms of radio environment. And I came across LoRa, and one of the engineering team found LoRa and said, hey, we found this thing, and we hacked together some solutions. And two things struck me. This is a really, really powerful technology, and pardon the pun because it's low power, but really long range, highly secure, and the sort of power profile utterly unlike cellular or Wi-Fi or other broadband technologies, which, whilst they're really useful in IoT, a bit of a sledgehammer for a lot of IoT use cases, but you could achieve that range and that security for so little power that you could run a sensor for 10, 15 years on a coin cell battery. That was striking, revelationary, I would say, to me. And the second thing that struck me was it was too damn hard to use. And much like other IoT technologies, hadn't been designed from the ground up to work with everything else. Because I think one of the things in the IoT that has been a failure of us all, really, is we've all designed these little islands that don't talk to each other, when the IoT is by definition something that has to be interoperable. I want to have the data from the conveyor belt and from the packing machine and from the truck and from the mine, and I want all of the data. And that requires multiple technologies to be used in conjunction with one another. And those technologies need to be easy. And so I guess this current chapter of my career, again, same principle. Wow, that's really interesting. That's going to change a lot of things. And in identifying Semtech, and Semtech, very unusually in the IoT space, we license our IP, but we own the IP that is the physical layer, which for LoRaWAN, which gives us a really big responsibility, I think. But it also means that we can move more quickly than more ecosystem-driven technologies like, say, Wi-Fi or Bluetooth can, to make it simple. Let me put it this way. If we don't make it simple, then it's no one else's fault other than our own. And that responsibility and that ability to change, I think, is fascinating. And I joined Semtech 3 years ago, and we've been moving as swiftly as is possible since that point to really deliver on that promise. Simple, easy to use, low cost, long range, highly secure method to connect not just one or two things, but to connect everything. And through doing that, to truly enable companies and businesses and you and I to make better decisions about how we do things and how we use things and what we produce. And that if there is any hope for us as a species to really fundamentally change the course of history, it's in technologies like this. Laura's not going to save the world, but it's part of a jigsaw that's going to at least give us an opportunity to change things materially. And that I find both intellectually stimulating, I find it very technically challenging, but also I've got kids. You look around you, if we're not doing something to address this issue, who is? And if we don't do something to address it, the timeline is debatable, but the outcome is certain. And so I personally feel a very pressing obligation to use everything I've ever learned to try and deliver on that promise.
That's amazing how your career has spanned over that time and jumped into kind of the cutting edge or newer technologies, which kind of leads me into that question. I do want to talk about some of the newer emerging technologies within your space, Alistair.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything non-proprietary that you can dive in on the LoRa piece of this a little bit, maybe? What you're leveraging? Obviously, there's things you probably can't talk about due to confidentiality, but something you can share around that, what you're doing now?
Sure. I mean, there's a few areas that and by the way, everything I just said, I feel incredibly fortunate to have been in a position to have these opportunities to actually work on interesting stuff. But the things that we're working on with Laura, and Laura in what is 5-6 short years, has been through this massively accelerated evolution when you compare it to the 20 odd years that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth have been around. We kind of went through our childhood and teenage years in breakneck speed and got to the point of having a mature technology that's widely adopted in record time to actually having, and a lot of that's to do with the ecosystem and of course the LoRa Alliance, which has really driven the development of the LoRaWAN protocol. But we've kind of grown up real quick. And so there are a couple of different focuses that our R&D team, which is largely based in Europe, actually, in Switzerland and in France, and in France was where LoRa was originally developed. And frankly, the genius idea of three guys who we acquired into Semtech to apply a very old principle from radar technology to communication network. And that's really at the core. Chirp spread spectrum, which is the way that LoRa chunks up data and sends it over spectrum in a power efficient way. So we are constantly looking at ways to make that better. Lower power, more range, more secure. And that's kind of a never-ending task that we will never finish because there is always opportunity to get better. We're now on the third iteration, really, of LoRa, the platform. The first generation, we launched, I think, in 2015 before I joined the company. The second we launched a couple of years ago. And the third we've actually just launched. It's a platform called LoRa Edge that improves sensitivity, reduces power consumption, and critically is a platform that incorporates compute power. It incorporates within a single chip a microcontroller and such. It is a system on chip, an SoC, as opposed to a transceiver, which is what we used to sell. But we've evolved that to address the specific needs of asset tracking. So the LoRa Edge platform allows you to use GPS and Wi-Fi based location without having a GPS or a Wi-Fi chip. And the reason that that's important is there's some things around me that, like my car, I'm prepared to pay the cellular tariff to locate my car, and my car's got a big fat battery in it, and I don't have to worry about power. But if I want to locate every single cable drum in my yard or every single package in a distribution system, you need something to do that in a low power way. So evolving that low power aspect to encompass more components of really important use cases like asset tracking, that's kind of part of that thrust too. The second kind of real push at the moment is in that context, actually, around location, because the way that the LoRa Edge platform achieves massively lower power than GPS is it does the compute in the cloud. So it takes the device, the chip can sniff or see, it can see a number of satellites, and there's some magic that happens on the chip, but it can send that data to a back end, and it can see a number of Wi-Fi IDs around it, sends that data to the back end, and the back end essentially calculates location based upon that data and returns it over an API call to the developer. So rather than the developer having to go build something, they can just make an API call, get the location of the asset, and then do the thing that they really want to do, which is build an application that uses that location to do something interesting, like optimize delivery time or reduce waste. So we're looking very seriously at ways to improve that location capability, both in the accuracy of the algorithms that we've developed over the years to take that raw GNSS data and raw Wi-Fi data and turn it into location, but also, again, in this spirit of interoperability, using other technologies to enhance. So indoors using things like Bluetooth potentially, or maybe even ultra wideband, or to get a better picture. And outdoors, again, I think forever trying to increase how you filter out bad data actually is really part of the challenge. What's a good satellite read versus a bad satellite read? And that's an area I think we're going to continue. LoRa is particularly appropriate for these massive distribution networks, for the parcels that turn up at your door and knowing where they are. And so that's an area. The third area that we're really focused on is by far and away the most important. And that is driving simplicity into everything that we do and making the product easy to use for someone who is a cloud-first developer or a mobile-first developer, as I said earlier. That encompasses quite a few things. I'm a terrible software developer across the pitch. I'm probably slightly better at developing cloud applications, and that's not saying much. But the paradigm I follow when I'm trying to figure out a cloud application is utterly different. And honestly, I could care less about how the communication works. I want it to work. I want the data, but I don't want to have to worry about the radio layer. I don't want to have to worry about configuring hardware. All of that stuff's alien to me. I'd say the largest part of our investment in R&D is figuring out the many ways in which you can reduce that complexity. We've just actually released, and it's taken, I've been in the company 3 years, so it's taken a little under that to get to this point. We've just released the LoRa Edge platform, as I said, and we've literally just released a modem stack that runs natively on that platform. So it runs in the microcontroller. And the reason that that's important is I can throw stuff at that modem and the modem takes care of it. So I can write an application that says, send a temperature signal every 5 minutes, and the modem will just take care of that and make it happen. Or I can write an application that says, send this big packet of data. I want you to chop it up and get it to the other end, and I don't really care how. And the modem will take care of that. And so that's just one example of what we're doing in that space. And I'm now verging into the stuff I can't talk about. But if you think about what a cloud developer is trying to do, and if you think about the languages and the development models that he or she are comfortable with, and apply that to a low power environment, you'll get a sense of where we're intending to go. The other part of simplicity, as I said, is interoperability. I'm sick and tired of hearing talk about competition in the IoT space, to be frank. I think if you start in this world focused on what your end customer is trying to do, and you orient your entire business philosophy and strategy around that, you're probably not going to go far wrong. And I've yet to meet the customer who said, oh, actually, I really like having to integrate these two technologies to make them work together. What I really love about it, I really love having to maintain a custom code stack so that the two things actually change. And what I love even more is every time one of those technologies changes, I have to redo all the work. I've never met that customer. And so we focus very much on, it's not for us to decide whether you want to use LoRa in conjunction with Wi-Fi or 5G. We see customers using those technologies in conjunction all the time with LoRa. Our job is to make it easy to do whatever you want to do as a customer and to abstract you from the work and the complexity that, frankly, the IoT ecosystem has served up to you for too long. So I would say not only is that the biggest area of our R&D drive, it is also our entire philosophy as a company, that our job, our responsibility is to put in the hands of developers a tool that is easy to use. And easy to use includes using with everything else and anything else, and using for whatever purpose you choose. Other examples of that drive include, how do we make it easy for customers to deliver a product? And we released also, based on the LoRa Edge platform, a tracker reference design, which is a physical piece of hardware that you can go buy. We built it in conjunction with a company called Tag.io and a big player in the ecosystem, our LoRaWAN ecosystem, called Actility. And we've been doing similar work with Amazon to put in the hands of developers an end-to-end kit that means I could either use it to build a POC, which is, I think, often the first barrier in any IoT project, building a POC so you can figure out whether it's worth, building the real thing, but that you could use to demonstrate the technology in a POC, but also that serves as a blueprint for the actual product. So I'm building those reference designs not to try and make money out of them. I'm building them so that when customers come to us and say, hey, that's really interesting, I want to go and build 1 million of those, we say, here's the design, here's everything you need. Here are some OEMs that you could work with that can help get you there. Because it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the impact of IoT. We also believe that there's not a lot of time here. We need to make these things happen quickly. And there's a commercial opportunity there, of course, but it's also driven, I would say more driven by we need to put these technologies in the hands of developers now, not in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. We can't wait for ecosystems to figure it out. And so building tools that make it easy for customers to very swiftly act and very swiftly build solutions, again, we see as our responsibility to do. And that gives you kind of the rough areas, but also the general direction, I think, of where we're trying to go as a company and where we're trying to help our ecosystem and the IoT ecosystem as a whole go.
Alistair, I appreciate you sharing that. You've really dived into some of the technology, some of the hands-on innovative things you're doing at that level with your product. So I appreciate that. I know a lot of our listeners will as well. And Alistair, just if you could share a couple words just on something from your career experience that might be helpful for those looking to get into technology like you did.
This is something I say to folks, every now and then, and it's normally something that produces a little bit of a raised eyebrow, let's say. I would say the most important thing I ever realized in my career, and it took me a while, was that most of the time I'm wrong, and pretty much wrong in every regard. I think that holds true in most businesses and most industries. I think it's particularly the case in areas that are ill-defined and emergent and really kind of the wild, wild west, like the IoT. And the reason I say that I'm generally wrong is, if you sit down and you map out what's going to happen in 3 years' time and build your technology roadmap, and you can sit there and feel content for a moment or two that somehow the future's certain. But pretty much reality sooner or later is going to slap you in the face. And it took me a while to kind of come to this conclusion. It was a hard-won conclusion driven out of building strategies and then sitting and scratching my head going, well, damn, that didn't work. What was the variable that was wrong in that equation? And inevitably it came back to, well, the plan that you built, Alistair, was wrong. What you thought about the future was wrong, because the data that you had to make that decision was incomplete, because you're fallible just like everybody else. And the reason that that's not something that, I concluded that I should give up on technology and go away and do something else instead was also equally simple. And that was the only way that you can be right, the only way that you can actually deliver the right sets of things that enable the right outcomes is two things. Figure out how to listen to your customer, and figure out fast, and figure out in a way that is not predicated on your own self-belief. Be able to listen to the good news and the bad. When a customer says, what you're doing is fantastic, the next question you should ask is, what am I doing that's wrong? And what is not right? What's imperfect about this product? What's the gap that you're left to fill? Why doesn't it work? How do you want to feel when you're using this product? What emotional reaction do you, and developers aren't often thought of being highly emotional beasts, but we're all emotional. How does this thing make you feel, and how can it be better? And the second thing is the realization that it's great to know, or at least have a vision of what customers want. And by the way, that knowledge changes on a daily basis. So you don't get to go and talk to customers once and then walk away and go spend 5 years building the answer and come back and ta-da, here you go. It's a continual process, because customers don't necessarily know what they want. In the IoT space, everything is changing every day in every way. But the second thing is, if you can get close enough to understanding who your customer is and what they want, and you're able to interpret that into things that you can act upon, the next most important thing is being able to act. And that is something that when you look at most technology organizations, the structure of those organizations and the way that they think and the way that they plan is antithetical to being agile. And I don't mean agile in terms of software development methodologies, though that's part of it. I mean agility in product and agility in business. Being able to build an organization, and this is very much what I spend my time doing at the moment, building an organization that is able to learn, but is also able to do something with that knowledge. That the first step is the product. And one of the byproducts of what we're doing with LoRa in making it easier to use through the tried and tested methods of software abstraction and cloud services, the other thing that does is it makes the product extremely agile. It means that I don't have to wait for another silicon platform to deliver functionality, because physics dictate that, give or take a few months, a new silicon platform like LoRa Edge takes about 2 years to build. 2.5 years. And if my cycle time is 2 years, I'm in trouble, because I might know what my customer wants, but I'm not a dang thing I'm going to be able to do about it. So it started for Semtech with the product, making the product agile. I can deliver features through software running on the device and features through cloud services in months, if not weeks, that would otherwise take me years to deliver. But the other important part, which is an ongoing process, I think, in any company, is making the organization agile as well. you could almost digest and throw up a management textbook on the, there's many of them, but really all of it boils down to some very simple things. You have to have a very clear vision of what it is that you're trying to do, not the product you're trying to deliver or the price point you're trying to hit, but the problem that you're trying to solve, and a very clear vision of why that's important. You need to build an organization that has the necessary skills, but also the necessary confidence and the necessary empowerment to go act. And that means devolving responsibility. It means enabling people to act within that agile product environment, to innovate and try stuff and get stuff wrong. And the reason I say also that that's partly is antithetical to a lot of the way that technology companies think is that traditionally technology companies have been very averse to failure. And that aversion increases exponentially with how much failure costs. And in a silicon company, and Semtech is a 60-year-old semiconductor company at its core, albeit a 60-year-old company in a significantly younger body. It's a company where mistakes cost money. And if you get a silicon platform wrong, that can be a real big deal. Breeding an atmosphere where people are prepared, feel enabled and empowered and supported to take chances and take risks, and coupling that with a product which can, bear the cost of those risks. I make a mistake in software, I can fix it. It's a hell of a lot easier than fixing silicon. That's also part of, I think, what I've learned, at least over the years. And again, I'm probably wrong in most of what I just said to you. But the only way I'll figure out is by doing it and by listening, to my customer. And my customer is both the companies that use and the developers that use LoRa, but also, honestly, the people that I work for, the people in my business. When you look at an org chart, it says they work for me, but actually, I think it's quite the other way around. My job is to help create an environment in which, in the case of Semtech, a team of really very brilliant engineers can be successful and can live up to their own personal potential as well. And it's that fluidity and empowerment and sense of mission and sense of purpose. I've concluded that's what you kind of have to do. And I'm still figuring out how to do it. But we're getting there and making significant progress towards that goal.
Alistair, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. I think this is a really in-depth interview around what you've done, where you've come, and your contribution to this ecosystem, as you mentioned. And I think it's simply amazing, and I can't wait to share this podcast out with my global audience. So, Alistair, it was a pleasure having you on today, and I look forward to speaking with you real soon.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Bye for now.